português. Nós temos agora a palestra da professora Laura Albert, que aceitou, né, o nosso convite. Essa apresentação, na verdade, ela foi uma sugestão, não é, do cluster, como eu falei para vocês, de mulheres na PO, né? Apesar do nome, né, ser um cluster mulheres na PO, novamente não quer dizer que é um grupo só, né, de mulheres. A ideia é justamente fazer, né, esse incentivo da pesquisa operacional, né, para a comunidade, para as mulheres, para que tenhamos mais representação, né, de mulheres, para que elas vejam que a PO é um espaço, né, para todos, mas, né, também, tá certo, para, assim, os jovens, né, para que a gente possa estar aí convidando, né, e mostrando, né, que o caminho da PO é um caminho bom em vários sentidos, né. E aí, dentro dessa linha, então, eu vou fazer a apresentação da Laura, né, em inglês, tá, para que ela possa entender, e a gente vai abrir espaço depois para perguntas, tá. Quem precisar fazer alguma pergunta, só lembro que precisaria ser com o microfone. Então, Laura is a professor and department chair of Industrial and System Engineering at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research interests are in the field of operation research, with a particular focus on discrete optimization with application to homeland security and emergency response problems. She has more than 70 publications in journals and research proceedings. She has been awarded many honors for her research, including American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellow Award, Industrial Systems Engineering Institute Fellow Award, the Inform Impact Prize, National Science Foundations Award. So there are many awards. We will not read all of the list. Professor Laura research has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of the Army, the Sandia National Laboratory also. She is the president-elect of Informs and the author of the blog Punk Rock Operations Research. She's also a passionate advocate for diversity and inclusion in engineering and operations research. So, Laura, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great honor to receive you here in our conference. So now it's your turn.
Thank you for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. And bom dia. I'm calling in from Wisconsin in the United States. It's in the northern part of the United States. And I wish I were with you today in person. I also want to extend a warm thank you to the Women in OR cluster. I was told the Women in OR cluster aims to discuss and inspire the participation of women in OR. And I want to do that too. And I'll have a few words at the end of the talk about this topic. And because of that introduction, I want to thank all of the collaborators that I've had. I'll be talking about some of my research today. I especially want to thank my female students that I've been able to mentor over the years. These are just the PhD students. The picture on the left shows my graduated PhD students that are women, and the picture on the right shows my current PhD students who are women. And these are students are always my favorite collaborators. And I'm happy to say more than half of the students I've mentored have been women. I have 3 parts in my talk today. In the first and longest part, I'll talk about some of my research. In the second part, I'll talk about research impact, highlighting some things that I've done, but really what we can do as a community. And at the end, I will offer some thoughts on how we can support women in OR. By the end of the talk, you'll hear more about 3 topics. 1, how OR can tackle societally important problems. Second, I hope I convince you that OR should not be a well-kept secret. We have a great story to tell, and we should broadcast that story to the world. And finally, together we can make OR more welcoming. I want to introduce myself a little bit before I get started. You know my name. I also have a family, a spouse, Terry, 3 daughters, age 18, 14, 11, and a cat, Lucky. I have some hobbies. I like to run and bicycle, listen to podcasts and oddcasts, audiobooks, and I also like doing some what we call bracketology in the US, so sports analytics. In terms of where I'm from, I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, which is not very far from Wisconsin. I did all of my college degrees at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And after I graduated with my PhD, I went to Virginia Commonwealth University. And in the first year there, I started the blog Punk Rock Operations Research. And about a decade ago, I moved to Wisconsin, where I've been a professor ever since. So in addition to being a professor, I'm a department chair and also the president-elect of Informs. Over the course of my career, I've studied a lot of topics. I describe myself as an applied optimizer who studies public sector applications. And over the years, I've studied a number of topics, including aviation security policy, fire and emergency medical services, kind of public safety, and I'll talk about this topic today, infrastructure protection and cybersecurity, more public safety, but here policing and the opioid epidemic, and finally, election resilience. This is a topic I've studied really recently since the pandemic. And actually, it's an election day here in the United States today. All right, so moving on to part one, where I'll tell some stories about my research, highlighting research I've done with women. I've published dozens of papers in public safety studying how to locate and deploy mostly ambulances and fire engines to emergency calls for service. And before I talk about this research, I want to frame it into what actually happens at the scene. And this is helpful because, you know, in EMS systems throughout the world, they have similar problems and similar objectives. So no matter what happens, it starts with an emergency, and typically a call is placed and a vehicle is dispatched. And that happens in the call center. I don't specifically study the call center, but I take into account what happens in the call center. Mostly what I study is what the service providers do, which is the service providers are on the vehicles, typically ambulances. They leave for a call, they arrive at the scene, they provide care, and when they're done, they leave the scene with the patient, take the patient to the hospital, and transfer the patient. And the service provider's work takes a while. And the system is evaluated according to response times. And this is true for virtually all emergency medical service systems in the world. And this is because every minute counts. It's often the matter of life or death for the patient. If you notice here, the response times are generally measured from when a vehicle is sent to when they arrive at the scene. And very early on, I noticed that if you were the patient, you might measure the response time a different way, maybe from when the emergency occurred to when care is provided. And there's a slight mismatch here, and also an opportunity to study response from a patient-centered care approach. But regardless, when an ambulance is sent to a call, it's unavailable to other patients for quite a long period of time. We usually call this non-preemptive service. And this introduces a challenge for how to first pre-allocate where those ambulances are so you can enable faster response times. But it also motivates the decision of which ambulance or vehicles to send. And of course, this means that all of the decisions are interconnected across time, of course, and also space, because both the vehicles and the patients are located geographically in a region. Okay, so moving on to my research, it's hard to summarize all the research I've done. I specifically today want to talk about the work that I've done in what's called tiered systems. We have multiple types of vehicles. And so the goal, of course, is faster response time. That becomes a little less straightforward with multiple types of vehicles. I've also studied, how to set the right response time goal. And the good news is that response times can be a good proxy for patient outcomes like survival, but they have to be chosen carefully. I've also taken a patient-centered care approach, so studying what patient outcomes could look like. Are the right resources sent to the patient based on their health needs? Specifically, I've studied multiple types of vehicles with different levels of service. And I've also studied the impact of non-transport vehicles. So from the timeline I introduced earlier, patients need to go to the hospital, and non-transport vehicles can't take the patients to the hospital. So this necessitates other vehicles and ambulances that can do that. And the decisions, of course, are maybe not as straightforward. Okay. So I've really studied how to get the right vehicles in the right place at the right time to care for patients in a way that enhances patient health. And all of these decisions are interconnected. I want to talk about a series of papers that I've done. Over the years, I've given many topics on my research in this area, and occasionally I'm asked a question about optimization and the value of optimization. Like, oh, aren't the decisions kind of obvious, especially in the question of ambulance dispatch? Why not just always send the closest ambulance? And so that, I would say, sometimes the decisions are kind of obvious, but optimization still has value. And it has value in a number of ways. One example is backup coverage. What if that closest ambulance isn't available? So in this example on the slide, there are 4 ambulances, and you can see that there are 4 districts associated with the 4 different colors around each ambulance. And these are, optimal response districts. So if there's a high priority call in the district, you send the closest ambulance. That's kind of an obvious decision. But what happens if that first choice ambulance isn't available? Now we have to look at backup coverage. And we look at the backup coverage solution. We see just 2 colors because 2 of the ambulances are really crucial for backup coverage, and 2 of them aren't as crucial to backup coverage. And the idea here is through optimization, we can identify how to make these decisions in a way that we free up the most crucial ambulances for high priority calls when they're really needed. Likewise, optimization adds a lot of value for low priority calls. These patients can probably wait an extra minute or 2. If you can send maybe a slightly more distant ambulance to those calls while not asking them to wait too long, this often enables you to keep a crucial ambulance free to possibly save a life. Optimization is also valuable in terms of ambulance location, so a slightly more strategic decision in terms of pre-locating ambulances. And it's also really helpful for making decisions that help balance the workload. So whether you use a heuristic or optimization, calls aren't evenly spaced in these regions, and solutions tend to use some ambulances a lot more than others. And whenever I've talked to a service provider, they've always had a goal of balancing workload. It's just good business. And optimization helps us identify good solutions that are also good for those service providers. And finally, sometimes there are multiple types of vehicles, and we can sort through how to get the right fleet mix. And I want to dig into this topic some more. I want to specifically talk about a series of papers that I've worked on that have studied tiered systems. And a tiered system has different types of vehicles with different capabilities. So the treatment level is pretty crucial, and there's 2 main levels of service. The first is what we call basic life support in the US. And this is typically an ambulance that provides basic life support, has 2 emergency technicians on board. And they can provide pretty basic first aid, and that's all. The alternative is advanced life support. And typically, there's an EMT, but also a paramedic. So the paramedics have a much higher level of training, and There's quite a bit more that they can do on the scene. And for really critical, high priority calls, sometimes patients need that care at the scene. Okay, so that's advanced life support. I've also studied a different type of advanced life support vehicle, the non-transport vehicle, which might have a single paramedic on it. Okay, so these are our different levels and different types of vehicles. And there's a picture here on the right of a non-transport vehicle, that van, sitting in front of the larger ambulance. And the non-transport vehicles are typically filled with medical equipment, and then, as a result, can take patients to the hospital. Okay, so to illustrate the possible trade-offs when using different types of vehicles in a fleet and different levels of service, I want to return to the slightly abbreviated version of a typical timeline of a call. So normally a call arrives, you send an ambulance, it's busy for this whole call, and it might take a while. In this research, we might also leverage triage data that's available when the call is placed to inform this decision, so we can possibly make one decision wisely. But in this context, we have one dispatch decision that's made when the ambulance is selected and sent to the call. What we're missing out is this possible recourse decision that's available after care is provided and the service providers assess the patient needs. And this becomes pretty valuable in a tiered system. So what happens in some tiered systems, and one that I was working with, is that they wanted to send 2 vehicles to a call. So this is multiple response. And they would send a basic life support ambulance and also an advanced life support non-transport vehicle. So this would send 3 individuals to the call instead of 2, which is arguably an inefficient decision. But maybe one of those vehicles is pretty close to the patient, so at least you might cut down and reduce the response time. And you also send the vehicle to the based on what the patient needs, because you sent both types of vehicles with both levels of service. Okay, so let's say we do this and we look at our recourse decision, and it turns out the patient requires advanced treatment. Well, now we're going to continue to tie up 3 individuals because the paramedic has to also take the patient to the hospital. So there's a small benefit in this case, but there's a big cost in that we're tying up and using 3 service providers instead of 2, which means we might not be as available to respond to other patients. Now, most of the time, the patient would only require basic treatment at the scene. And if we use multiple response and send both types of vehicles, here we can free up the non-transport vehicle because it's not required, that care wasn't required by the patient, and then they don't have to take the patient to the hospital. And this ends up being a benefit, one that's worth assessing. And the ambulance would still take the patient to the hospital. Okay, so sorting through all that, there's a lot of pros and cons and benefits and drawbacks. It does introduce some complexity that would need to be managed by any type of department. The benefits include always sending or better matching the resources to the needs of the patient through multiple response. The second benefit is, again, through multiple response, you can possibly reduce response times because one of those 2 vehicles may be very close to a patient. The third benefit is you potentially have more vehicles when using non-transport vehicles, because instead of 1 ambulance with 2 service providers, you can have 2 non-transport vehicles with 1 service provider. And this is also an avenue for cutting down response times. The drawbacks are, well, there's a lot of multiple response, so vehicles are busier and they might not actually be available for patients. There's also fewer transporting vehicles, and some of the decisions are not so obvious, like when do you use multiple response, when do you not use multiple response. And typically service providers need a little training and experience with those types of decisions. So early on, I published a paper studying whether we should replace an ambulance with non-transport vehicles. And the answer was yes. And this did lead to some follow-up work using deterministic and stochastic optimization models. Over time, I published a series of papers with my collaborators that studied ambulance location in this context, dispatch with multiple response, also taking into account that we might not exactly know what the patient needs at the time of dispatch. And we also studied fleet mix. The first county I worked with actually took the results and implemented them in a real world setting. It was a little political, but they handled the politics, I handled the optimization. And I was part of a team that won a National Association of Counties Award, which is a non-academic award. And it was pretty fun to see my research inform practice. I want to highlight some of the results from the papers. One is this idea of multiple response. This is enabled by this fleet mix question. It opens up our decisions that help us take a big step forward in improving patient response. One observation is that we tend to want to use multiple response a lot. That's actually optimal. And I have here an example of, we're maximizing. So on the y-axis, we have the fraction of calls that meet our response time goal. So more is better. And on the x-axis here, I have the fraction of calls that really require an advanced response. So in actuality, that might be about 0.2. Just using optimization over a heuristic, such as always sending the closest ambulance, we get a benefit at basically no extra cost. This is just by using optimal dispatching. If we allow for, and I should say that this is single response only. If we look at multiple response, we take a really big step up in improving response times. Those benefits are really outweigh the costs. And this is just a really enormous benefit, again, at no extra cost. And it's all enabled through fleet mix. So with fleet mix, in general, more non-transport vehicles are better because they enable faster responses and better matching of resources to patient needs. But that's only true up to a point. There is a sweet spot. So in this graph, again, we're maximizing, and I'm showing for a fixed number of personnel, the number of ALS non-transport vehicles. So the more non-transport vehicles I have, the fewer ambulances I would have. And there is an optimal value or an optimal range, in this case, about 6 to 8 ambulances. And if we have too few non-transport vehicles, then we're not really getting all the benefits we can. And if we have too many non-transport vehicles, that means we don't have enough ambulances to transport all of the patients. It's been really fun working in emergency medical services. There are so many different problems to work on. But over the years, I had worked with a number of agencies on a number of projects, and I recognize that response times are important for public safety. For example, every minute counts, and it often is a matter of life and death. In fire services, fires spread very quickly. A delay of a minute or two might mean that a fire is not contained. And in police, response times are also important. Sometimes it's a matter of life or death, but often it's a matter of customer service. And having quick and being responsive helps public trust in these important public service agencies. But response times don't tell the whole story. As I talked to service providers over the many years, it was obvious that there was a new challenge that was emerging that was very time-consuming for these agencies. And that is the opioid epidemic in the United States. And many agencies, particularly police, are spending more and more time responding to these calls. And it's good to have a good response time. That's always a good goal. But there was something longer term that they needed to address that couldn't be addressed in a single shift. And I have a graph here showing the 3 waves of opioid overdose deaths in the United States. And this is incredibly sad. And it's not getting any better, unfortunately. You can notice here the black line is the overall opioid death. There's a sharp increase in about 2015 when synthetic opioids such as fentanyl became very popular. They're just much more powerful, and they're manufactured large scale. So there's just a lot of the supply in the United States. You'll also know a second really sharp uptick in 2020, and this was due to the pandemic. It's there's just a lot of despair and loneliness, and that fuels substance use disorders, unfortunately. So there is a goal in the long term to improve community health. These challenges are particularly challenging for police because they respond to overdoses, but mostly they respond to all the related drug-related crimes. And this leads to just a large societal expense, and they're not able to kind of balance with how they respond to all of these opioid-related calls versus demands. They just have too many demands, and this is a challenge. So I started working on this problem, and the good news is that there's a lot of evidence now that treatment is very helpful, especially medicated-assisted treatment. And so there is a goal here, especially for public safety agencies who work as first responders. They really have the ability as first responders to potentially refer those who use treatment. Of course, the benefits aren't immediately achieved, like response times. It might take years to really achieve those benefits. And it's not just enough to refer somebody. You really need partner agencies who can help that individual make a transition and stick with treatment. So a lot of police agencies in the United States are really working on what they call diversion programs, where they encourage people to enter treatment, usually by dropping a criminal charge. And here in Madison, Wisconsin, there is the Madison Addiction Recovery Initiative, and I started collaborating with this team. And we had some questions, does diversion make a difference, especially for repeat crimes, and what are the implications for policy? Here's how the program works. So initially, somebody has an encounter with the police. It ends in an arrest. And if they're eligible based on their criminal history and the type of arrest, they can be referred to treatment. So that individual would then have to follow up with a counselor who does an assessment and refers the individual to treatment, and also assigns a recovery coach. And all of that is done by partner agencies. That individual would then have to stick with the treatment plan for 6 months. And if they do, all of their initial criminal charges are completely dropped, and they're completely erased from the criminal record, which is a huge benefit. And this motivates many to stick with the program. The questions we have is, does this actually decrease overdoses and crime longer term? The challenge is that nobody's randomly assigned, and nobody randomly chooses treatment. So getting to causation is harder to assess. And the correlations look really good. Like, if you actually look at some of the initial data, but they're just correlations. So making a long story short, the answer is yes. It seems that this type of program does reduce rearrest in the short term. And I'm currently with another student studying the implications of these types of policies, plus other types of policies such as crisis response. Okay, so far I've talked about tiered emergency medical services and policing and the opioid epidemic, so public safety problems. Other things I've studied that I won't necessarily talk about are disaster recovery, so how different infrastructure owners can cooperate potentially to restore a network after a disaster. We use non-cooperative game theory to model this. I've alluded to election resilience, and this is just, there's a lot of really interesting problems in election having to do with resource allocation, location, and queuing theory, performance over time. There's an election, and then there's a hard deadline, and also equity. So the graph here, the picture here shows the optimal location of drop boxes in a large city in the United States, and it shows the traveling salesman route to collect those drop boxes. I do want to talk about cybersecurity planning, because this is an emerging application in operations research, and there's a lot of opportunity. Protecting cyber infrastructure is such a huge problem, and the reason it's such a good problem for operations research is because there are many, many risks. There are adaptive adversaries. There are limited resources. These are always resource-constrained settings, and there's multiple criteria. There's also a life cycle, which I have pictured here. So identify the risks, protect the system, detect, respond, and recover. So there's opportunities throughout this life cycle. I focused only on protection. And in the protection space, one issue I've studied is how to protect cyber infrastructure and also its supply chains. So many of the risks are introduced from the outside and percolate in. They aren't directly introduced to the infrastructure. And two of the most common supply chain risks that we see in practice are malware and unqualified service providers. But there's a host of other risks. And there's a lot of work to do. I want to summarize some of the work that I've done in this space. And really, I've tried to study how to prioritize security mitigations. And specifically that I've used the detailed attack plans, which provides some structure. And this leads to some layered networks. So ultimately, I'm trying to study how to prioritize or select security mitigations. And there's a number of attack plans. There's multiple attacks with different goals because there are different types of adversaries. And we've modeled linkages between these layers in the network and use this to inform optimization models that ultimately lead to a recommendation for the right mix or portfolio of mitigations. And so I've studied this on like the non-adversarial space where there's no recourse, and also with adaptive adversaries who do have recourse. And the stochastic programming models are usually pretty hard to solve. One of the projects I was looking at really was trying to study how to introduce time into the objective. And in this case, we have many attack projects. So all these adversaries are trying to complete their attack projects as quickly as possible. And of course, they're finding their critical paths and managing their projects. I have 3 attack projects here, and the critical paths are shown in boldface for these projects. And one way to think about managing risk is to push these attacks off into the future as far as possible. And if we do that, we can possibly delay steps in these attack projects, and then the adversary would have recourse and can re-optimize their project. And this leads to a stackable game approach. If we have some mitigations, they again have these linkages to some of these arcs. And we're trying to find the best combination of mitigation subject to our budget that would push these attacks, like a weighted sum of these completion times off into the future. And the optimal solution might be these 2 orange mitigations. And there's a couple insights from this work. One is you may have noticed that the critical path for one of these attack projects changed. Another time, some of the mitigations might work, but they don't actually delay the project because they're not delaying a critical part of this attack project. And by studying the project, that gives us additional insight into what steps of these attacks we really need to protect against. I won't go through all my results, but I will say that the stochastic programming models are really hard to solve. Sometimes they don't even identify feasible solutions in a reasonable amount of time. So my work has studied different algorithms, such as approximation algorithms and Lagrangian heuristics based on Lagrangian relaxation, how we can identify good solutions quickly. Next, I want to talk about research impacts. And I will note that to have impact on our research, of course, we have to do good research. That's right in the center. And there's a number of ways we can have impact with our research. Of course, it can influence practice. And I've already mentioned that. Somebody can take our results and implement them in some way. We can also influence policy and maybe affect legislation. So having more of a policy impact. But sometimes these policy and legislation impacts can be really broad in the scope because everybody has to follow these recommendations that maybe came from your research. We can also do public outreach and public engagement, possibly with the media. And I want to talk about that topic some more. The good news is for all of these topics, we can also win awards, which is pretty nice to be recognized in that way. And I think it's really important to think about some of the research impact we can have. I'll mention some of the impact that I've had through my research. First, my research has helped spur the adoption of non-transport vehicles in some regions of the United States. One of my algorithms is used in software to route fire engines when there's multiple response. I've also served on the Wisconsin EMS board, so this helps influence legislation. My policing research has already encouraged departments to use or expand diversion programs. And I'm also a police commissioner. I didn't talk about my aviation security research, but it was used by the TSA PreCheck, and that was part of the reason why they chose TSA PreCheck over alternatives. And I also serve on a global cyber consortium, which seeks to help improve cyber planning and the adoption of best practices. What I spend a lot of time doing is talking about my research with the public, sometimes with the media. I'm really passionate about this for a couple of reasons. One is that I think it's really essential for researchers studying public sector problems to take our research solutions to the public. We have an obligation to share this with them because it affects the public. I'm also motivated to do this as a woman in operations research. I didn't see a lot of women as role models when I was growing up, and I want to change that. And of course, we need a lot more role models out there who don't all look like me. So I always encourage others to take part in some media and public engagement if they're interested in that. When I talk about my research with the public, I do have to translate the findings and make them more digestible to the public. And that takes some work. But by making it more digestible and transitioning our research for public consumption, they really are interested in what we do, and that helps them continue to follow science. And I'm happy to say that there are a lot more opportunities to engage the public since 2020, in part because operations research is such a valuable toolkit, and it's been so valuable to many of the problems that we face during the pandemic. But also the public is really interested in hearing from experts, especially in these last 2 years. And it's been really exciting, actually. It's a great opportunity for operations research. I looked back at some of the engagement I did this summer, and this highlights some of the variety of opportunities that are available to us as a discipline. First, my university has a video series called Were You Wondering? And they filmed about a 2.5-minute video with me talking about networks and traffic. I was also asked to be a guest on the local news to talk about the lottery and the mathematics behind it. I wrote an op-ed that was published in a national publication about the insights from my election resilience research on locating ballot drop boxes and what science has to say about it. And I got a lot of people read that and responded to it. I was also on a science podcast to talk about operations research for social good. And I was a guest on a radio program to talk about operations research and analytics. I'm always happy to get the word out. And these are just some of the types of opportunities that are available to us. Okay, so why do public outreach? I think this is really valuable, and I want to note that there are like 3 broad buckets of why public engagement is so important. First is we can really improve scientific literacy when we talk about our research to the public. It helps the public become curious about science and learn more and feel that the science and math that is being taught in schools is really valuable. And this also helps shape policy conversations when we talk about the insights from our research. And ultimately, this can help the public adopt some more scientifically informed policies. The second benefit is that we can build trust with the public. And I've really seen over the course of my lifetime, the support for universities and science be eroded. And especially in the last couple of years, we've seen this, some distrust of science. So we constantly have to build trust with the public. And sometimes it's just one conversation at a time. Most people are pretty passionate about their research, and this really is a good recipe for building trust. And once we have trust, we can have more support for universities and ultimately for scientific research. And third is it just really helps the whole ecosystem and leaves our scientific communities in better shape for the next generation. Through a lot of these efforts, we inspire the next generation to um, choose scientific and engineering careers when they go to college. And then the next generation is there contributing to our discipline. And it also ensures that, in my case, that there's US and science and technology leadership. But regardless of what country we're in, it really does ensure that there's leadership there in the next generation. And we do it just one piece at a time. All right, moving on to the final part of my talk, supporting women in operations research. And for this part of the talk, I want to, what we say, putting on my Informs hat and talk about this through the Informs perspective. Informs has a strategic plan, and it's pictured here in graphical form. I know the font is really small. You're not intended to read that. But right in the middle of the strategic plan is the vision and mission statements. And the vision for Informs is better decision-making for a just, prosperous, and sustainable world. And there are some other elements of the strategic plan and these rings around the strategic plan. One of these spots, it says the following statement: to advance diversity, equity, inclusion in all that we do. Right, so it's really central to the strategic plan. And you can read about it more on the internet. I have the link here. So there's a lot going on in the DEI space at Inform. Much of these efforts benefit women in engineering. There are two main subdivisions in Informs that really support women in operations research. There's Women in OR and MS, or WORMS, and there's also the Minority Issues Forum, which has a disproportionately large number of women in this forum. And both of these subdivisions really have a lot of activities that have benefited women for decades. One thing that you might notice from the Informed Strategic Plan is that, the goal is to advance DEI in all that we do. So not just rely on a few members or these two subdivisions of Informs, really asking everybody to advance DEI. And there have been a few activities here to support that just in the last few years, some of which predate the most recent strategic plan. One advance is the Code of Conduct that was introduced about 5 years ago. And this is updated to include a policy for reporting violations to the Code of Conduct. There are a lot of structural and policy changes happening just over time organically. So one is more inclusive award committees. Third is that Informs introduced an implicit bias video this past year, really aimed at viewing within the subdivisions and spurring conversations. And it's really been well received. And I've heard that many subdivisions have started to use that to start conversations and keep some of the work going. And there's also the DEI Ambassadors Project. And this is a grassroots effort where members can just step up and take on a small project and then present the results at the annual meeting, and also work as in a group. They have regular check-ins. And I went to the event at the annual meeting. It was really fantastic to hear about what everybody was doing. And at this past year's annual meeting, there were a number of events related to DEI. There's now a DEI keynote speaker every year where they broadly speak about a topic, a diversity, equity, and inclusion topic. There's now some programming related to DEI at the Early Career and Future Academic Colloquia. So this is really helping educate kind of early career professionals and academics. There's the first ever LGBTQIA reception and the first ever military veterans reception. So these are all kind of steps forward to help everybody discover, to help more members feel really welcome at Informs and that it's their professional home. And the title of this talk is Advancing the Future of OR. And so one thought that I want to leave you with is that we have to study all of these problems that are so important to society. And we have the tools to do that and to really make a difference. And my research is just a drop in the bucket. But it's not just about the OR that we do, it really matters who does OR. And whenever we've broadened who does OR, and I've been in operations research for decades now, I've seen that it's a catalyst for innovation. When we broaden who participates in OR, we look at old problems from fresh new perspectives, and we're able to tackle new problems that we didn't know that were there before. And this helps us stay on the cutting edge. So with that, I want to summarize my talk. First of all, OR has a great set of tools to help tackle societally important problems. The second is we can broadcast our message to the world. OR should not be such a well-kept secret. And third, we can all make OR a little bit more welcoming if we work together. And thank you for your attention.
Laura, thank you. Thank you for your talking. It was very exciting. Now I would like to open for the public to some questions.
Congratulations, Laura. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to know more about you. Luciana Buriol, a friend of mine, a friend of us, a Brazilian researcher that you know. It's enthusiastic of your work and research. Thank you. Thank you for spreading our art in your blog, in the social media, and to collaborate with us to attract women for this science field. One question. Tell us more about the impact of informed society in the public policy in the USA, and what do you said for us about the Brazilian community of or the Sobrapo society for this, to treat to the public policy and establish a good relationship with the government, Brazilian government, please.
Thank you for your kind words. I'll again keep my Informs hat on and talk about some of the work that we've done at Informs. And it is really valuable for professional societies to lead that effort because it really does take a village, and we can do our piece individually, but we've been able to make bigger steps forward through Informs. 4 years ago, Informs started the Advocacy initiative, and I was part of a team that provided leadership in that. And there were a couple efforts I think that were really valuable. One is they prioritized getting members in front of policymakers and legislatures, and just having these conversations informs them, because a lot of politicians have real problems that they want to solve. It might be healthcare, it might be housing, and then they can hear from experts who have some insights into that. And then that helps them realize that, operations research has the solutions, and they can come to us. And that creates this virtual cycle. Through that activity, a lot of good things happened. One is we built a lot of these relationships, so they keep coming back. Also, we discovered that there were other problems that were really pressing, and sometimes we'd have follow-up conversations, bringing in another member. And we did have members review legislation that was being considered, which was incredibly impactful, that we got to weigh in on legislation that would affect the entire United States. One of the pieces of legislation had to do with kidney exchanges and organ exchanges, because we can save a lot of lives if we can use our tools more broadly in that space. So that's number one good goal. The second is just Informs can help with the training and publishing of op-eds, where we really shape the conversation, and especially getting our op-eds written in public or popular media that legislators will read. So that's one way to kind of move the conversation forward. And once you start writing either on a blog or in an op-ed, you write as an expert out there, more journalists will find you and they will call you up. So there's a couple of topics where, like the lottery, I'm constantly getting phone calls to weigh in as an expert. So that's kind of interesting. And the third is with federal science funding. And it might work a little bit differently in Brazil, but generally this is part of the government spending. And we want them to spend a lot of money on science research because it's so valuable. And we want some of that money coming to operations research. And by keeping these conversations going, it does have this virtuous cycle that kind of helps that funding be there in future years and for the next generation. And I'm happy for Sobrato members and officers to talk to us at Inform so we can share some of what we've learned. And that way you don't have to start from scratch.
Thank you very much, Laura. So is there any other question or comment? Just a minute.
Hello. So you talked about cybersecurity, and we know that with the development of quantum computers, there are a lot of people worried about how they would be capable of cracking these codes easily. Did your research ever get into that part?
No, I have no insight on that. It sounds important, but unfortunately, I can't really weigh in on that.
Okay, thank you.
It does highlight the opportunities that are available out there for all of us with a scientific background.
Okay. Just one more.
Oh, thank you for your presentation. I was interested about your cybersecurity approach. And you talked about the attack projects. And you mentioned that you somehow establish what's the critical path in the attack projects, and then your infrastructure tries to somehow establish a portfolio of actions to somehow slow down the critical path, right? If I understood well. I was wondering about the attack projects. Do you establish this attack project? Do you somehow plot these attack projects based on previous experiences, or you somehow try to guess what the attackers will do, and therefore you track your plans about the infrastructure? I would like you to tell us a little bit more about these attack projects. How do you trace them? How do you map them so that you can build on your infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. This work is admittedly a little bit academic, and it was motivated by these collaborators who wanted us to get the science out there and work on providing insights. Getting this data, like the attack projects, is really time consuming. And you always rely on in this case, subject matter experts to shed light on what these attack projects could look like. And sometimes they can be labor intensive. We ended up using some from publicly available data sets. There are not nearly as many as I'd like that are out there. But to us, that part of the project was really interesting. And it is one of the challenges for cybersecurity is that there's so much data that should be available, but it's for obvious reasons, it's not generally shared, which is a real barrier to doing some of the science and moving it forward. Good question.